Good evening. My name's Crispian Lees. I'm the head of education at Advantage Learn. And this evening we're going to be talking about the national benchmark tests. I'm going to try and help you start to navigate that landscape going into 2022. So well done to those of you who've joined us this evening. You're getting ahead on it in terms of the considerations for next year. Just before I get into that though, I do want to give you a brief background on who Advantage Learn is. We're an educational organization founded out of Durban, but largely online. And we essentially focus on helping high school learners with self-study resources in maths and science, national benchmark test preparation, which I'll allude to towards the end of the presentation this evening, advanced program maths and advanced program physics. And then we help learners with exam preparation and our subject academies, which are in maths, science, and then we have a robotics academy as well. So that's a brief overview in terms of who Advantage Learn is. We're going to focus in on the national benchmark tests this evening, and the whole purpose of this evening's presentation is to help you to understand what they are all about. So in terms of what we will be covering, first of all, I'll discuss what the national benchmark tests are. We'll then talk around who needs to write the NBTs and why they are important. And then lastly, we'll touch on how you can prepare for the national benchmark tests. So I imagine many of you joining this evening are going into, you or your child is going into matric next year, and you need to consider doing the national benchmark tests. So let's kick off with then, what are the NBTs? So the national benchmark tests were commissioned by Higher Education South Africa in 2008. They're run out of a research institute known as CTAP at the University of Cape Town. And essentially the mandate for the national benchmark test was to help universities to assess academic readiness for tertiary study. So universities were recognizing that learners, the new age of learners that were entering universities in South Africa, had a different context, and the National Senior Certificate was not necessarily, the National Senior Certificate, which is the matric certificate, was not necessarily giving the universities high enough resolution on how ready these learners were for university study. And the major reason why Higher Education South Africa wanted to understand that was so that universities could adjust and put bridging and supportive programs in place to help the new age of learners to succeed at a tertiary level. But universities quickly recognized that they also gave great insight into the type of candidates that were applying to universities, and they became very, very helpful in terms of making admissions decisions towards tertiary institutions. And so while the major aim of the national benchmark tests is to assist universities with information on how they can better support learners entering tertiary institutions, they are also used as placement tests at certain universities, largely in the very competitive degree programs where there are many, many learners applying for seats in those programs at those universities, and the universities need an additional criteria with which to understand which learners they should admit into that program. Because ultimately, the function of higher education in South Africa, whether it's a university or a private tertiary institution, is to deliver skills into the economy. And so ultimately, universities want to ensure that they are admitting learners that have the highest probability of success in their programs, the highest probability of completing the program and passing. So so that they can fulfill that ultimate goal, while also taking into account fair access to tertiary study as well. And so they are largely around assessing academic readiness for tertiary study, and that have increasingly become used as entrance requirements at certain universities and certain degree programs. The national benchmark tests are made up of two assessments, the AQL test and the MAT test. And I'm now going to talk a little bit around those two tests. So please, I didn't mention this in the beginning, but if you have any questions along the way, feel free to post them in the chat or in the Q&A or in the chat on Facebook, and Norm, who's supporting me this evening, will ensure that I recognize all of the questions and address them. You can ask them at any stage in the presentation, but we will also have a Q&A session towards the end. So, as I mentioned, the national benchmark tests are comprised of two tests, the AQL test and the MAT test. The AQL test essentially is an acronym for academic and quantitative literacy. And so there are two domains tested in that test. The one domain is academic literacy and the other domain is quantitative literacy. Academic literacy is all about demonstrating the ability to read, understand, and communicate meaning from a body of text. So it's a language component, and it's all about being able to effectively engage with content, mostly in a text form, testing comprehension, testing communication skills, testing your powers of inference in terms of what's written and what the underlying meaning is. And so the academic literacy component is largely a language component of the test. Then there's the quantitative literacy component, and that is a mathematical component of the AQL test. It is somewhat similar to mathematical literacy at a high school level, where it's mostly about functional mathematics in the everyday context. So performing numerical calculations that relate to volumes, surface areas that you might perform in the everyday context, understanding ratios, understanding percentages, and those kinds of things that are largely covered in mathematical literacy at a high school level. And interestingly, the quantitative literacy component learners do find it significantly challenging for two reasons. One is that this type of mathematics, if they're taking core maths at a high school level, the quantitative literacy type of mathematics is very different to the core mathematics. A lot of story sums that learners who are doing core maths don't necessarily have good practice in. A lot of graphical interpretation, bar graphs, pie charts, those kinds of things. And core maths learners don't necessarily have a lot of practice and are well versed in that type of numerical literacy. And so be careful not to fall into the trap of assuming that because I do core maths and I'm good at core maths, I'm going to do well at quantitative literacy. It's not necessarily the case. And we often find that most learners fall down largely in the AQL test relative to the MAT test, which I'm going to talk to in a moment. The other major challenge is that in the national benchmark tests, in both of the tests, that no calculator is allowed. So both of the tests have a mathematical component to them, and there's no calculator allowed. And many learners these days are far too reliant on their calculators. And so they've lost their powers of arithmetic and estimation. And these are things that they need to sharpen up for these tests in order to succeed in them. The other significant point I need to make about the AQL test is that if you need to write the NBTs, the AQL test is the compulsory test of the two. Okay, and I'm going to get to who needs to write the NBTs in a moment. In terms of the style of questioning, they are standardized assessments administered via CTAP. The administrating organization administrates booking and testing via nbt.ac.za, which Norm will post in the chat. And that is where you will book your test and all of those, where you'll see the test dates and book for your test. But what I was mentioning was the type, the format of the test is that they standardized assessments. They multiple choice in nature. And in terms of the AQL test, some of the domains that are tested are questions on grammar, punctuation, vocabulary, and then for the quantitative literacy section, numerical application as well. Okay. And so that leads me on to the second test. The second test is known as the MAT test, and it's simply short for the mathematics test. So this test is purely a mathematics test, closely related to core mathematics, but very much tests a student's ability to apply their knowledge. And the more difficult questions on the MAT test are a lot more insightful than the questions that learners are used to encountering at a high school level. The MAT test is also a standardized assessment via multiple choice, and then essentially learners will need to demonstrate their understanding of mathematical concepts, and significantly, there is no calculator allowed. And this is a massive stumbling block, and it's something that, as I mentioned before, learners need to actually start to work on in readiness for the national benchmark tests. There's two other things that I want to mention in terms of the national benchmark tests and the MAT tests. The one is that because of their multiple choice nature, they are very different tests to what learners are used to. Because they are multiple choice, they are right or wrong, and there are no part marks. And so that is an interesting dynamic and something that often leads to much lower marks with learners attempting the national benchmark tests. And a good exercise to kind of bring that home to those of you listening is, I would challenge you to go home and take your last mathematics test. Look at the test, look at the mark that you achieved, but then go through every single question in that test and see if you got 100% for that question. Did you get 5 out of 5? Were you completely accurate in your answer? Because those are the questions that you would have got right in a multiple choice format. The questions that you only got 3 out of 5 or 2 out of 5 on, you would have got wrong and not earned any marks, because there's no room for part marks in a multiple choice test. Then after doing that exercise, recalculate your mark that you would have achieved on that maths test, and it paints a very different picture. And so what we largely see with learners is that their marks from core maths to the MAT test in the national benchmark test drop in the region of 20 to 40%. And it's for a number of reasons. One being that no calculator is allowed. Second being that they're not used to the multiple choice style of assessments. And lastly being that the very difficult questions in the MAT tests are completely unscaffolded. So your really difficult questions in high school maths are largely a question that is comprised of multiple parts, A to E, for instance. Question A is not necessarily such a difficult question, but it helps you towards question B, which is possibly a bit more difficult, which then helps you towards question C, which is more difficult. And then D and E are the most difficult of the questions, but the scaffolded nature of the question has actually led you along the solution path, and in that way helped you to solve it, because they've asked you strategic questions which has guided your thinking, and enables you to then answer question D or E, which is the most difficult question, relatively well. In the national benchmark test, for the very difficult questions, and for all the questions, they're unscaffolded. So you go straight to essentially E in that scaffolded question, and you need to figure out the solution strategy, the steps A to D that you need to take to get there. And so that makes it quite difficult, and something that learners do need to work at. Okay, that then brings me on to the next thing that I want to talk about, and that's who needs to write the national benchmark tests. Okay, Most grade 12s applying for tertiary study in South Africa, as well as learners looking to enter competitive degree programs and or scholarship programs, will likely need to write the national benchmark tests. However, it is university and degree specific. So you have to do your research in terms of whether or not you need to write the national benchmark tests. Some universities don't require it. Some universities require it for some of their degree programs and not all. Other universities like UCT require it pretty much across the board if you're applying towards UCT for all faculties and degree programs. I think with the exception of engineering and the built environment, which they don't necessarily require it. But these requirements shift from year to year. And so the one key takeaway that I want to make sure that really hits home this evening is that you need to do the due diligence for your context in terms of whether or not you need to write the NBTs. And if I may suggest an approach in that regard, list out, and this is obviously not a simple process, it's simple to explain, not so simple to do, because as a grade 11 or matric, you are still figuring out what it is that you want to do beyond school, and that is not the easiest process. But this is one way to go about navigating it. List down the 3 or 4 careers that you can see yourself going into, and then the associated degree programs that you would need to study, the associated university degrees that you need to study in order to get there. Okay, so that will give you a list of 3 or 4 degree programs that you could potentially see yourself doing at university. Then make a list of the 3 universities, South African universities, that you would consider studying towards. Okay, and then go and do the research at each of those universities for the 4 or 3 degree programs that you are considering. If any of those degree programs at any of those universities require the national benchmark tests, then our advice is that you should write the national benchmark tests, because you're likely, when you apply to university, going to apply to multiple universities for multiple degree programs, because you're not guaranteed to get in at your first university of choice and your first degree program of choice. So you do need to consider applying slightly more broadly to ensure that you get into a university and a degree that suits you. And so that would be my approach in terms of navigating these. If you then need to write the national benchmark tests, as I mentioned previously, the AQL test is the compulsory test. If you need to write the NBTs, you will need to write the AQL test. You may or may not need to write the MAT test, again, depending on the degree that you're applying to at the universities that you're applying to, the degrees that you're applying to at the universities that you're applying to. So the MAT test is largely a requirement for degrees that have a large component of mathematics in them. And so assessing learners' mathematical ability is really important. So like your sciences, engineering, health science as well, those types of actuarial science, your commerce degrees, those ones are mostly the types of degree programs that will require the MAT. There is another layer to that, and that is if it's a highly competitive degree program, even if it doesn't, and what I mean by that, lots of people applying to get in and only so much space, those degree programs will often also require the MAT test, even if they don't have a large component of mathematics in the degree. Medicine, for instance. Medicine is a highly competitive degree to get into. Hundreds of thousands of learners applying to get into a limited amount of universities that do medicine, which have limited spaces. And so they often require the MAT test as well, because it gives them an additional criterion on which to make a good admission decision in terms of which learners they should admit into the program, which learners have the highest probability of success in a very challenging degree like medicine. And so that's that's an overview in terms of who needs to write the NBTs. The next thing I wanted to address is why you need to prepare for the NBTs. Okay, and at Advantage Learn, we strongly recommend that you prepare for your national benchmark tests. They are a very unique type of assessment that is very different to what learners are used to, as I've mentioned already. The multiple choice format proves challenging for learners who haven't practiced. There are also strategies and techniques that you can use to better answer multiple choice type questions, which you can develop by practicing. Process of elimination, for instance, estimation, those types of things can be incredibly helpful in a multiple choice type test, and learners haven't necessarily developed those muscles to answer them well. Thirdly, as I've mentioned before, removing a calculator is a big issue for many learners. Far too many learners are far too dependent on their calculators, and it really is a problem. It is so important that learners have a degree of skill in arithmetic and mental maths and estimation. And so my advice to those of you learners listening this evening in terms of how one of the best things you can do to prepare for the national benchmark tests is to limit your use of your calculator. Put your calculator away in your maths class at school. Only pick it up if it's a domain that 100% requires the use of a calculator. You can't do it without the use of a calculator. For instance, if they ask you for tan of 43 degrees, you need a calculator for that. No one knows what that ratio is off the top of their head. Well, no one is probably a broad stroke. There's probably someone who does. Tan of 30 degrees, though, that's a special angle. That you should know. So there are instances where you really don't need your calculator, and you should only pick up your calculator as a last resort in your core maths and your maths literacy or your maths literacy class, because that will serve you really well in the national benchmark tests. The last and the major reason why you should prepare for the national benchmark tests is that these results do generally affect your admission into tertiary institutions and universities, and so that they can affect your future. And so to give yourself the best shot at the university and degree of your choice, which is the stepping stone to the career that you're aspiring towards, it's really advisable that you prepare for the national benchmark test and give yourself the best shot. All right. In terms of their importance, I've already mentioned some of these aspects, but the competition at local universities is intense. There's only so much capacity at our higher education institutions, and there are many learners looking to study at them. And so, as I've mentioned, the NBTs are being utilized quite broadly as an admissions requirement, and therefore it's important that you do well in them so as to differentiate your application and improve your chance of success, your chance of getting into the degree program and university of your choice. You need to be cognizant that more and more institutions require it to be written before the application date for that course closes. So there's also a requirement for by when you need to have written your national benchmark tests, which you need to be mindful of depending on which degree you're applying towards. And then the last point is to reiterate what I've previously said, is that it has varying degrees of importance per university, per department. And so do that exercise of listing the possible degree programs that you're going to apply towards, I would say your top three choices, and the potential universities or higher education institutions that you would be applying towards, and I'd list the top three, and I'd do the due diligence of researching the requirement for those three degree programs at each of those three universities. And if any one of them requires the national benchmark test, you will need to write the national benchmark tests. Okay. The last thing I'd like to give you insight into is how to prepare for the national benchmark tests. This is very repetitive, but do your research. Requirements are different for everyone. That's the initial thing. And those of you that have joined the informational webinar this evening have already taken the first step in terms of preparing for your NBTs, because you're starting to understand the landscape and what it's all about. It's not a simple landscape to navigate because the requirements vary very substantially. Get to know more about the NBT. We've got a free quiz of NBT style questions that you can take on advantagelearn.com, and Norm will post that link in the chat so that you can give it a try. Try a couple of questions of NBT style questions and see how you fare. Then simple things that you can do: work hard and apply yourself to school mathematics and your language subjects. So the languages of testing for the national benchmark tests are either in English or in Afrikaans. So in terms of the AQL test, which has an academic literacy component, which is a language component, that is either in English for learners that take the tests in English, or in Afrikaans for learners that take the tests in Afrikaans. So work hard at your math subject and your language subject. That will serve you well towards the national benchmark tests. And then lastly, we help learners to prepare for the national benchmark tests. We run in-person, live online, and self-study courses that help learners towards both the MAT and the AQL tests. And you can consider taking a preparation course with Advantage Learn. Okay, so at Advantage Learn, we really pride ourselves in being the leaders in national benchmark test preparation. We don't administrate the national benchmark tests. As I've mentioned earlier, those are administrated by CTAP, a research institution that was commissioned by Higher Education South Africa to administrate tests. They administrate the booking of the actual tests, and that can be done via nbt.ac.za. Advantage Learn was the first organization to help learners to prepare for the national benchmark tests. We have many years of experience and have helped thousands of learners to succeed at these tests. And we provide full AQL and MAT test preparation in all of the learning mediums that you can expect: live, online, in person, or via our guided online courses. And those are available in both English and Afrikaans, as those are the languages of testing. Included in our courses are Advantage Learn mock tests, where learners can actually practice tests, as well as online student support delivered through our chat feature, where you can talk to one of our national benchmark test preparation experts. Okay, and in terms of the considerations that you should take if you want to consider doing a preparation course, it's about choosing which learning style is most appropriate for you. Our workshops are available in all major metros in South Africa, as well as via our live online framework. And these give you face time with an educator for your math and AQL preparation. As I've already mentioned, they include mock NBT tests. They include an NBT preparation workbook. You get face time with our expert educators, and these are at a set date and time, and largely available in English and Afrikaans. Our online courses, these are more similar to a classic online course, which enables learners to define their individualized study schedule. So while our workshops are at a set date and time, our online courses can be taken at any time, anywhere, as long as learners have a device and an internet connection. And those are also available in MAT and AQL. That gives you 12 months access to the course. Equally, learners will have access to the live chat on both streams where they can engage with our educators. Our online courses are available in both English and Afrikaans, and also include our NBT, our extensive bank of NBT mock tests and mock questions. This is our pricing going into 2022 for our in-person, our workshops, our live online workshops, and our online courses. Where in our in-person workshops, you can join a physical classroom. Via our live online workshops, you can join an online classroom. And then via our online courses, you can get access to the most comprehensive NBT online course in South Africa. In terms of booking for an NBT preparation course, you simply go to advantagelearn.com, navigate to our NBT section, and select your preparation course of choice, and then add learner details, confirm your booking, and proceed to checkout, and you will from there get access to your preparation course and be able to start learning. We understand that this is a tricky thing to navigate, so if you don't necessarily have time to engage with the intricacies, you might want to consider our premium pass offer, where it's our complete NBT preparation offering for one simple, straightforward price. Learners on our premium pass get unlimited access to our MAT and AQL live stream courses, can attend any of them or as many as they like. And significantly, learners and parents on our premium offering get access to a dedicated guide who will contact you to advise you on your preparation dates, your online access, and also advise you in terms of when you should consider taking the test relative to your context in terms of what universities and degree programs that you are applying towards. So for those of you that are finding you need a bit more guidance, or you don't necessarily have the time to drill into the detail, this is something that could help you. As I mentioned previously, try the test, try the free quiz on advantagelearn.com. It is very helpful in terms of giving you an idea of what the national benchmark tests are all about. And Norm has placed that link in the chat. And I believe I have covered everything that we plan to cover with you this evening. The last resource that we want to share with you is our summary of NBT requirements in South Africa. We've done the due diligence and researched the various universities and degree programs and what their NBT requirements are, and we've summarized those for you in a very helpful PDF, which Norma's going to link in the chat so that you can click through to it and download it and look at that. I must just mention that PDF is a summary of the NBT requirements for the 2022 intake. So those are the requirements for matrics this year that are going to study at a university next year. The requirements are updated annually, and we will update that PDF for the 2023 intake, which 2022 matrics will be considered as part of going into university in 2023. And so that will go through an update, but it does give you a bit of an idea in terms of the lay of the land of what the current requirements are in South Africa. Uthara is asking, are we going to do practice questions? No, Uthara, not on the informational webinar this evening. We don't do those during an information webinar. This is all about just helping you to understand what the national benchmark tests are all about. You can try our free quiz to do some practice questions. Those are some good questions. Alternatively, we do many practice questions and have an extensive bank of practice questions on our NBT preparation courses. So you can consider enrolling in one of those for practice questions. Thanks for your question. Yeah, so that's everything. Let me just address these frequently asked questions as a final item for this evening. Do I have to send my results to the universities I am applying to? No, you don't. CTAP will make those, the National Benchmark Test Project, which sits within CTAP, will make those results available to the institutions that require them. So when you apply to your university, they will know that you've made an application, and the university will acquire your results from the National Benchmark Test Project to facilitate your admission and the admission decision. So you don't actually have to send your results through. The administrating organization does that. Okay. How much does the NBT cost? I believe it was 110 Rand per test this year. And 220 Rand for both tests. So if you were just doing the AQL, it was 110 Rand to take the test. If you're doing the AQL test and the MAT test, it was 220 Rand in total. So that's a ballpark figure of the cost it is to take the test. Where can I write the national benchmark tests? There are opportunities to write the test in person across the country, and there are opportunities to write the test online as well. So the NBT project have the competency and have been delivering the tests online for the past 2 years as a result of the pandemic, and they utilize sophisticated proctoring technology, which ensures the validity of an online assessment. So learners can take the test online, or they can take it in person at venues across the country. So if you don't have the online infrastructure, you can take it in person, or if you prefer to take it in person, you can take it in person. But if you have the infrastructure, you can take it online from the safety of your own home, and the administrating organization takes you through the checks to ensure that everything is valid in that regard. They have sophisticated technology that picks up audio, your video, patterns in your eye patterns in terms of whether you are referencing anything. And so the online tests are really robust and valid, and any nefarious attempts will be picked up by the technology, and those results will be invalidated, which is not something you want. All right, who typically needs to sit the MAT test? I believe I did address that earlier. It's largely your degree components that have your degree programs that have a large mathematical component to them. So the universities need to understand your mathematical ability, or highly competitive degree programs where competition to get in is such that universities need an additional sorting mechanism with which to make a sound admissions decision. So it's largely your Bachelor of Science degrees, your commerce degrees. Engineering faculties to a large extent have in the past required them, health sciences, and then your science degrees, as I've mentioned, medicine as well. All right, and that brings us to the end of the presentation this evening. So thank you so much to all of you that have joined us. I hope you found it helpful. Our next webinar will be on the 24th of November. So next week, I believe that's a Wednesday, and I'll be addressing the changes to the IEB advanced programs that have recently been announced, and helping you to understand what they all mean. Exciting changes which make those programs even more recognized globally. And I'll be talking through that in our next webinar. If you're interested in that, you can navigate to advantagelearn.com/webinars to sign up. So that is everything this evening. Thank you very much for your time. All of the best as you navigate the national benchmark tests. And if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to Advantage Learn. We are only too happy to help with any questions that you might have. Thank you and good evening.